Today we are looking closely at a developing report concerning one of the most frequently discussed monetary reforms in Iraq, the possible removal of zeros from the Iraqi dinar. The information circulating suggests that Iraq's Finance Committee has placed strong emphasis on moving forward with legislation connected to removing zeros from the currency, with the proposed amendments reportedly being forwarded to Parliament. However, there is an important distinction that every dinar follower should understand from the beginning. The information described in this report indicates that a legislative process may be moving forward, but it does not yet provide final confirmation from the Central Bank of Iraq that a currency redenomination has officially begun, nor does it establish a new exchange rate for the dinar. According to the information provided, a representative of the Central Bank of Iraq participated in an important meeting involving Prime Minister Al-Zaidi and the head of the Finance Committee. The purpose of that discussion was reportedly connected to changes to a long-standing law involving the removal of zeros from the Iraqi currency. The report further states that amendments were needed and that the amended legislation has been forwarded to Parliament for implementation. If these details are ultimately confirmed through official Iraqi government and central bank channels, the development would be significant because it would indicate movement from discussion toward a formal legislative process. For years, removing zeros has been discussed as a potential monetary and administrative reform in Iraq. The basic concept is often misunderstood, particularly in online currency discussions. Removing zeros from a currency is generally associated with redenomination. In a redenomination, the government changes the nominal units used for prices, wages, accounting, and financial transactions. For example, if 3 zeros were removed, a price of 25,000 old dinars could theoretically become 25 new dinars, depending on the exact framework adopted by authorities. But that does not automatically mean that the purchasing power of those 25,000 dinars suddenly increases by a factor of 1,000. This distinction is extremely important. A redenomination is primarily a change in the denomination and accounting structure of a currency. It is not automatically the same thing as a dramatic appreciation of the currency against the US dollar. The economic outcome would depend on the exact law, conversion ratio, implementation schedule, monetary policy, and treatment of deposits, contracts, salaries, prices, and existing banknotes. That is why the reported involvement of the Finance Committee and the central bank representative matters. Monetary reform cannot simply be implemented because of an online announcement or because investors expect it. A major currency restructuring requires legal authority, institutional coordination, technical preparation, and public communication. Parliament's role therefore becomes important if legislation is genuinely required before the central bank can move to the next stage. The report says that the Finance Committee has already decided or authorized moving forward from its side, and that Parliament now needs to pass the new law. At this point, however, viewers should treat that claim as developing information rather than as a completed event. The critical confirmation would come from official parliamentary documents, government statements, and ultimately the Central Bank of Iraq. Until those institutions publicly confirm the details, it would be premature to describe the removal of zeros as completed or guaranteed. There is another important point for Iraqi dinar followers. Even if Parliament passes legislation concerning the removal of zeros, implementation would probably not happen overnight. A currency redenomination can involve extensive preparation. Banks would need updated accounting systems. Businesses would need to adjust prices and financial records. Government agencies would need to modify payroll and budgeting systems. ATMs, payment systems, banking software, contracts, tax systems, and financial reporting procedures could all require changes. The central bank would also have to communicate clearly about the treatment of old and new banknotes. Citizens would need to understand the conversion ratio, exchange period, deadlines, banking procedures, and whether old notes would circulate alongside new notes for a transitional period. These operational details are often more important for the real economy than the headline announcement itself. For the Iraqi economy, a carefully designed redenomination could potentially simplify transactions and accounting. Iraq currently operates with large nominal numbers in everyday financial activity. Reducing the number of zeros could make prices easier to read, accounting systems easier to manage, and certain transactions more convenient. It could also improve the presentation of the currency in financial systems if the reform is implemented alongside broader banking modernization. But removing zeros by itself does not solve structural economic challenges. Iraq still needs sustainable fiscal management, a strong banking sector, efficient payment infrastructure, productive private sector growth, investment, and confidence in financial institutions. The value and stability of the dinar ultimately depend on economic fundamentals and monetary policy, not simply on how many zeros appear on a banknote. This is particularly relevant when considering the short-term implications of the reported development. In the short term, the biggest impact may be increased attention and speculation surrounding the dinar. Currency holders may hear claims about immediate revaluation or extraordinary exchange rate changes. But responsible analysis requires separating the legislative process from those expectations. A law concerning redenomination does not automatically establish a new market value for the dinar. The central bank would remain a crucial institution in determining how any monetary reform is executed. If Parliament approves amendments and the government formally moves forward, the next stage would likely involve detailed implementation planning and official communication. That is where dinar followers should focus their attention rather than relying on unofficial claims about specific future rates. In the longer term, a successful redenomination could support greater efficiency in Iraq's financial system if it is part of a broader reform program. Simplified denominations can make accounting and transactions more manageable. But the success of such a reform would depend heavily on maintaining monetary stability and preventing confusion during the transition. Another issue is inflation. If the public misunderstands a redenomination as an immediate increase in purchasing power, businesses and consumers could face confusion over prices. Authorities would therefore need strong communication and careful monitoring. The objective would be to change the nominal unit without creating unnecessary disruption to real purchasing power. For ordinary dinar holders, the most important lesson is simple. Watch the official process. If Parliament formally passes the legislation, that would represent a stronger confirmation than reports about committee discussions. If the central bank then issues an official statement explaining implementation, that would provide an even clearer picture. And if new banknotes, conversion procedures, timelines, or exchange mechanisms are announced, those would be the practical details that determine what happens next. It is also important to remember that the Iraqi dinar's official exchange rate policy and any future redenomination are separate questions. A change in the number of zeros does not necessarily mean the exchange rate against the dollar will suddenly move to a dramatically different level. Those are separate monetary and economic decisions, and they should not be combined without official evidence. The report we are examining today, therefore, represents an interesting development, but not a finished monetary event. The reported meeting, involving a central bank representative, the Prime Minister, and the Finance Committee, could indicate that the subject is receiving serious institutional attention. The reported forwarding of amendments to Parliament, if officially confirmed, would represent another step in the legislative process. But until Parliament acts and the central bank publicly confirms implementation, there is still an important gap between reported progress and completed reform. For the Iraqi economy, this could become significant if the proposed changes are ultimately approved and implemented as part of a wider modernization strategy. Iraq has been working to strengthen its financial infrastructure, improve banking practices, and modernize monetary and payment systems. A redenomination could potentially fit within that broader framework, but it should be viewed as one component rather than a standalone solution. For dinar followers, the best approach is patience and verification. Avoid making financial decisions based solely on social media reports, rumors, screenshots, or claims of guaranteed exchange rates. Major monetary reforms leave an official trail through legislation, government announcements, central bank communications, and banking instructions. Those are the signals that deserve the greatest attention. So, as this story develops, the next major questions are straightforward. Will Parliament formally approve the proposed amendments? Will the Central Bank of Iraq officially confirm that it is moving ahead with the removal of zeros? What conversion ratio would be used? What would happen to existing banknotes? And what timeline would authorities establish for implementation? Until those questions are answered officially, the responsible position is to recognize the reported progress while avoiding unsupported conclusions. The Iraqi dinar story continues to develop, And this reported movement around the removal of zeros is certainly something worth monitoring. But remember, a legislative development is not the same as an immediate currency revaluation, and a redenomination does not automatically create new purchasing power. The real significance will depend on the final law, the central bank's implementation plan, and Iraq's broader economic fundamentals. We will continue following official developments and separate confirmed information from speculation so you can better understand what each announcement actually means for the Iraqi dinar and Iraq's economy. If you found this update useful, make sure to subscribe to Iraqi Dinar News and stay connected for responsible, factual, and carefully analyzed updates. Thank you for watching. And remember that this content is provided for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.